I will give some brief statements on to give the opportunity for some remarks. When I started this morning, I said I want to have some answers, some clues for bringing the museum one step further for the next generation. And one of the leading remarks by you is that we can do without museums. Well, as a matter of fact, I have to write a new position paper for my board of supervisors. And when I start with the statement, Albert van thinks that we can't do without, so that's probably is not the right position for a proposition. Well, one of the things I really think is remarkable is that the role of ICH is debatable. Not only in the context of superdiversity, but you know, a lot of the examples come across about the best practices from the museums. Apart perhaps even the traditional museums you referred to before, that almost in every presentation there is a strong relationship between the intangible cultural heritage and the embodiment of cultural heritage as well. So I think if we try to separate as if there are two separate spheres, I think that's still, and I started this morning, perhaps this is the wrong ideas on getting on, because almost all, even the final session was elaborated proposition literally with props. So I think that you can summarize it. You all have strong stories, and strong stories need strong artifacts. So if perhaps this is not the meaning of the work group to make sure there's a separate sphere. So I think the discussion is perhaps should be less on what is the meaning of what do we consider to be intangible or not. But and I think this is, to me, it becomes crystal clear from the discussion that there is an ongoing debate about what is the role of our institutions in general, be it a museum or not, for our society. And I think this is something we are all still puzzling. And I thought one of the very interesting things I want the presentation is when I said new business models, and I think that actually one of the papers actually showed, and I thought it's very interesting, for somebody not from a cultural background, he came up with a very interesting business model. So I think that we should learn, if we want to bring our institution one step further, we have to work interdisciplinary, not per se from intercultural heritage to cultural heritage, but perhaps we can learn a lot from the business model. Because if we are convinced that what we are doing generates money, income, then in a neoliberal context, this is the best way to put your statements. So the believers need a lot of engineering as well in order to turn it in a viable managerial proposition. So the relationship with entrepreneurship, and you mentioned the role of entrepreneurship, but we have to be careful when we discuss entrepreneurship in an intangible cultural heritage setting, for instance in the West Kruiskade. Because we all know from the work of Susan Hall, who wrote a lot about superdiversity and neighborhoods, that decision-making process, why ethnic entrepreneurs start their business, is perhaps a way of, there is no other opportunity. So entrepreneurship can be a way of exclusion. So we have to be careful. And I think it's interesting that the projects done by, for instance, the Real Rotterdam Heritage Project, what we're trying to do is not just focusing how this intangible heritage could work, but how entrepreneurship can create new added values because they are generating new networks. And then there's the network analysis. And I really like the paper by Hester and Malus, because this was one of the few discussion moments this day when we all went emotional. And I thought it's a very interesting how emotions are relevant. And I like to refer to the work of Dominique Moisy in this context, because he actually said, what's the new classes of civilization has to do with emotions. So if we discuss superdiversity from a sociological, cultural or political perspective, we actually are dealing with the emotional turn. So perhaps we should add an emotional turn as well. And I think it's very interesting how these networks can be elaborated. And I think it's very interesting that the proposition made by the ENT network is perhaps we should work on such a model and try really to implement it and try, okay, if we use this model, this exercise, this network, the emotions, and we map them, perhaps we have a concept and idea of an exhibition. I just, in our short break, I discussed it with Hester and Marloes, and I said, I take up the challenge and I want really try to use your model because that's very important, I think, that the academic exercises finds its way in the museum practices. Although we start gathering all these best practices, but we want to move on. We need new methodologies. Interesting is that when we are discussing the intercultural, intangible cultural heritage, and then there's, of course, the point of view of Wayne. And it's very interesting that when we had the deep democratic exercise, and Wayne, when he comes up with a statement, everybody, because we all believe, we all slowly move towards Wayne, because Wayne has a proposition we all want to share. And it's very interesting. Franklin, when he posed a proposition, Wayne, he started the debate. And I think this is necessary. There isn't a kind of heritage, and when heritage is debatable, it's like art. You know, we need these confrontations. And it's like you could say, what they do in CERN. You know, you got the Higgs particles, and just speeding up the Higgs particles, and then they collide, and because of this coalition, is create a new dynamic energy. And then is, of course, the difficulties, how are you going to turn that in a museum model? Because our supervisors, board of supervisors, they don't want confronting heritage. So that means that perhaps you need to develop parallel ways of experimenting. And as a matter of fact, what we actually now do here in this museum, you are now in the laboratorium. So perhaps we should address the things we do, the experiments, not frame them as a kind of participation or integration, or we want to be turned into happy, super diverse people, but just say, this is our R&D. And R&D, we should invest more in R&D. We never know what is the rate of return of R&D, but in the long end, perhaps we are right. And then I turn back to the discussion we had yesterday when we show these democratic characteristics of society. We all know here that we are right in the end, in 10, 15 years. So we need to develop business models, sustainable business models for museums. And in order to do that, we need more money for experimenting. So that's why we need to bring up a position paper, not just for a belief, but actually you have to invest in us. Because if you do not invest in us, this will be the end of the heritage industry. So make this a real tough proposition. That would be my, and I think that we need to learn a lot of all these different experiments. And I think that Imagine IC, I really like what they're doing there, and that's because they actually made the research lab as their core business. Everybody is, of course, looking for win-win situations. And I thought when we discussed the round tables about win-win situations, I said, well, if you want a win-win situation, this is not, you know, this is so, we called it in the Dutch way, polder, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But perhaps we should not, win-win situations are debatable in itself. But I think that you all know, and the best practices show that you all are experienced working with communities. What you bring in, all the ideas, the concept, the lot of passion you put into your work, the way you try to connect new diverse communities with your core business. I think this is great to notice, great to watch, and Albert, he made a beautiful summary of them. So I think that we should, that gives us hope. So when there is the final question, should we continue or should we close the shop, as Albert proposes? I think it's too early to close the shop, but perhaps we can open another shop. And when we are dealing with the discussion of super diversity, we have to make a distinction, I think, when a museum wants to do nothing about super diversity, they should be entitled to do so. Said, well, I'm not happy with super diversity. I don't want that. Fine. Especially when you're a private-owned museum, who cares? It's your own money. But when you're based on government money, I think that's a different position, because then there is money from the community and you want to spend it as favorable as possible. So I think that in the end of I think that many people are addressing different kind of research. And I think, well, perhaps there is, when you use the term super diversity, perhaps we are dealing with a kind of super museum, meaning that there should be diversity within the museum. And I think this is very hopeful. So that means that we are dealing with shared authorities, and we must be aware, concerning the concept of super diversity, that there are always, and there will always be, dispersed communities. And so there's still a lot of work to be done by the experts. Thank you for your attention.